Well, if you ask the average Charlestonian, I think in some ways, sadly, the overwhelming response would be that we have grown so much that we now have crushing traffic congestion. I think people who move here from other places, whether it's Washington, D.C., or even Charlotte or Atlanta, certainly have a different take on that. But I think that for folks who've been here for 20 or 30 years, it seems like we're in the same boat as Bangkok with traffic congestion. On the positive side, though, and I think I want to emphasize that because there's less awareness of what has happened that's positive. We have adopted over almost 20 years ago now a comprehensive plan in Charleston County that establishes boundaries, edges to the city, where cities will stop and where rural areas will be maintained, wetlands, wildlife habitat, farms, and forest. And that is unique. It literally is unique in South Carolina that we have that planning structure. Other places have pretty much made it, the whole counties are available for any sort of development. Most counties, even on the coast, do not even have zoning. So the planning and zoning in Charleston County and the collaboration with the major cities, being the city of Charleston, Mount Pleasant, and some of the smaller towns, has actually been exemplary. And we are much better off for that. And in fact, one of the unexpected consequences and benefits of that planning has been that we are better prepared to deal with sea level rise and climate change than if we hadn't done that planning. Well, I think the primary and certainly the most visible impact of climate change is our rising waters, increasing flooding, what some people call nuisance flooding or dry weather flooding, which basically is a function of higher sea levels. We've seen an increase over the past century of almost a foot, about an inch a decade. And what we also now know over the last 2 or 3 decades is that that rate is accelerating. And that's consistent with the projections that have been made worldwide about sea level rise and climate change that we will see anywhere. And the projections are fairly broad, but most people agree that there's something in the neighborhood of 3 feet or more between now and the end of this century. So the impacts that we feel specifically here almost every month are increased flooding, nuisance flooding, good examples being Morrison Drive when you get off of the Mount Pleasant Bridge, which is almost every other day there's water standing in the road there, and it didn't used to be that way. The other thing, though, which is not really directly attributable, and no scientist would claim that it was, to climate change in a sort of directly causal way, but it's statistically attributable, is the increase in the frequency of hurricanes and the intensity of hurricanes. Now, again, I want to make sure that people understand that no one in the credible scientific community is saying that Irma was caused by climate change. I think one thing we need to understand better as citizens and as decision makers is that statistics is a pretty important deal. And these are really statistical processes. So what has been said for many years now, beginning in the 80s about climate change, is that there is a statistically higher probability that hurricanes will occur and that they will be stronger. And we're seeing that. And we saw just in the last 3 years, we've had the rain bomb 3 years ago, we had Matthew 2 years ago, and then we had Irma this year. Now again, I think this is such a complicated, apparently, and more importantly, politicized argument that it becomes difficult for people to get past the ideology or the political affiliation that they feel they're making when they say climate change is or isn't causing a certain thing. But the bottom line is that what is undeniable here, what is undeniable is that sea level has risen and it is rising faster than it was. that we have had in the past 5 years a series of storms that have been more frequent than we have had in the past. Whether that will continue and in what pattern it will continue, no one knows exactly. But this is the same phenomenon we face as individuals, homeowners. We buy insurance because we're not sure whether a tornado will blow the roof off of our house. We want to make sure. We are pretty good statisticians when it comes to our own families and our own assets. We become less good when it comes to our sort of collective assets, the city, the state, the nation, the environment. And that is when we begin to get political about it. Well, we have not been confronted with a major storm here until recently since Hugo. I mean, we've had, in 1989, we've had some small hurricanes that didn't hit directly that brought a storm surge, but nothing like the 10-foot or 12 or 15-foot storm surge that Hugo and these Irma and Matthew brought. And so I think we've been lulled into a sense of complacency. And our leaders have responded to that complacency by not really doing anything or not operating at a pace that's adequate to prepare us for what we can be pretty sure is going to happen more often. And as I say, you've got two things. One is hurricanes. We can't predict when a hurricane's going to come, but we can predict with some statistical accuracy that there will be a certain number of hurricanes over the next decade. The less we get down to the fine grain of this month, this year, the better we are at predicting. There is no question that sea level is rising. That is not a statistical question. That is a fact, and it is evident to anybody who lives here, and it is evident in the form of lost time in the workplace, damage to houses, damage to the infrastructure. The roads are suffering as a result of being flooded too much. Asphalt doesn't do well when it gets salt water on it on a regular basis. So we're seeing that right now. And I think, though, that the sort of the moment of revelation, the Saul's vision on the road to Damascus here, has been the 3 storms in 3 years. We now know one, okay, the rain bomb, we could say, well, maybe that was a phenomenon that won't happen again. And then Matthew came through, and well, 2 in a row, maybe that's not representative of anything. But 3 in a row, especially when it has, for many people, it had a tremendously expensive, costly impact personally to people who have flooded now 3 times in Mount Pleasant, downtown Charleston, West Ashley. I think people are past the point of being interested in the debate of whether climate change is real or not. They just say, I want somebody to do something about this. I want somebody to respond as if we were going to have some more of these in the future, because that is a reasonable assumption to make. In the same way, again, that we take out health insurance and we take out hazard insurance. Well, on the subject of whose responsibility is, and this is one of the core challenges, it's easy to point fingers. It's easy to say, local government says, well, these aren't our roads. These are the state roads. DOT controls these roads. We can't do anything about them. The DOT says, well, we're not the one who collect accommodations tax. We aren't the ones who are responsible for the community at sort of writ large. So the problem has been deciding who is ultimately responsible. But to me, it's pretty clear. The local decision makers are the ones who are the frontline decision makers. The mayors, the city councils, and the county councils. They are the drivers of, and have always been, of whether infrastructure investments are made and where they're made. That's been the case with bridges and new roads. DOT builds them sometimes. Sometimes DOT owns them. But they are not making these fine-grained decisions at the local level, and they aren't responsible for that. They don't follow these things. Christie Hall in Columbia isn't going to be coming down and saying, you know, you need a new battery because you had waves breaking over the low battery. That's the responsibility of the mayor of Charleston and of the city council. I think, again, I hope, and maybe I'll say I hope that these last 3 episodes have been eye-opening and have conferred a sense of urgency on the mayor, city councils, and others who will then drive the agenda. For example, when the DOT built the Ravenel Bridge, that wasn't because they wanted to build it. It was because the city of Charleston and Mount Pleasant needed it, and they made that case. And then we had our representative in Columbia go and find some money, and the DOT found some money, and everything worked out. But it was only because the local leadership was engaged and energetic about it. And they weren't saying it's somebody else's responsibility or it's not my fault. So I guess my simple point is that the decision makers are our local representatives, and they must draw on local resources, state resources, and federal, and deploy those to implement a comprehensive plan of response and plan of anticipation, because we are anticipating this to be something that will become worse over time. That has been the case. We see that in this decade. And every single credible prediction, and even if you don't believe in climate change or believe humans have some responsibility for it, no one is disputing that this trend is toward higher seas, more intense storms, and more frequent storms. Well, we have to be more precise about where we should develop. I think, you know, in the good old days, before the Coastal Zone Management Act, or bad old days, you could fill salt marsh and you could put your house on it. And on Isle of Palms, that happened to a great extent, and it happened everywhere, really. We learned that was not a good way to do things, not only because of the environmental impact, but also because of the instability of fill land. And not only because of sea level rise and because of flooding, but also because of earthquakes. So we have progressed in that respect, but we have not progressed enough on the planning side to be able to make the kinds of determinations about where development should and should not go that we need to make. And that's one reason that you see so much flooding of houses out West Ashley and in the Church Creek Basin. That area, parts of that were areas that should not have had housing on them in the first place. So I think the key is, again, we have planning processes, we have zoning codes. We need to implement, and quickly, and it's not complicated really, a system of sort of flood overlays where we say basically these are areas that we know are flooding or will flood because they happen to be particularly low level, and these are areas we're not going to sanction new growth in. I mean, we're not, because it's expensive for the community to have to pay back a homeowner whose house floods, and we're finding this now with Bridgeview in a big way. The other side of that coin, and this is the one people haven't mentioned as much, is, well, where is growth appropriate? And that's another determination that we can make, again, looking at elevation maps, but also combining that with what we know about where infrastructure is, where transit is. Public transit is, by the way, a key and missing part of this region. And basically say these areas probably should have more intense development. This is not a sort of net loss scenario. It's a more intelligent shifting around of where it's appropriate to support new growth versus and at what levels of intensity, and where it isn't. In my op-ed, what I was frustrated by, and I think I'm just reflecting, I think there's a large constituency who feels the same way, is that in spite of all the talk about this, there'd been almost no action on the mitigation, storm surge mitigation and adaptation and resiliency agenda. There are probably a dozen committees that are operating. Some of them know about each other and others don't around the region to look at climate change and sea level rise and resiliency. We are spending in Charleston $8 million a year on flood response. That is about 1/10 of what we ought to be spending. The reason we're not spending more than that is that the City of Charleston Engineering Department made the judgment that it was too expensive to talk about spending more. And they didn't even talk about it. I mean, they didn't. If the first response is, in my op-ed I refer to this, that the city gave to how much would it cost to make Charleston a resilient place was, we don't know. We don't know what the projects are that are necessary. We don't know how much they would cost. Well, the public deserves to know. That the public deserves to know how much it will cost to protect and preserve the community, and if it's too much. I mean, if there's some areas that maybe it is very difficult or expensive or unnecessarily to protect, then they can say, well, you know, these areas we might want to buy them out, and we've been talking about that West Ashley. But to simply say, we don't really want to tell you because we think that you won't like it, is the absolute opposite of leadership. It is a deferral and a forfeiture of the responsibility of leaders and of technical administrators. And so my point was, it's not hard to figure out what needs to be done. I mean, we've had plenty of studies done, and in some ways we don't need to do more studies. There are a few we could benefit from, but we've got a list of projects that needs to be done right now, and there's no dispute about them. And the city, next day, they came out and they said, well, actually, we were wrong. We do know, and that we think the number is between $1 and $2 billion. Well, I added up the projects that had been discussed, and it adds up to about $1.7 billion. So it's a pretty good estimate. It is not adequate, it's not acceptable to say, well, that's too much. They're not the ones, they shouldn't be making that decision. In fact, they should be making the opposite decision, which is to say, the preservation of this place, which is 300 years old, requires us over a certain period of time, let's say a decade, to spend $1.7 billion. That's $170 million a year. That's about 20 times what we're spending right now in the city of Charleston, but there's some areas beyond that benefit from this. So it's not exactly apples to apples. But anyway, the main point is that we need to challenge our citizens to agree that this is an investment they feel is important. We need to give them the information. That's what good leaders do. And then we need to make a case for what we think the conclusion is. Well, that was the other point that I made in the op-ed. Where does the money come from? And the assertion that has been made is, well, one, we don't know, but two, it would probably be too expensive for you to agree to. Both of those assertions are incorrect. We have, in Charleston County, a year ago, we passed a $2 billion half-cent sales tax increase that will generate $2 billion over the course of 20 years. That is, 1.2 billion of those dollars are bondable for transportation projects. Now, all of these, virtually all of these flood control needs have something to do with transportation. So that's local government pot one, $1.2 billion, and the net present value of that would be $800 million. The second pot is that we have state funds at the DOT. The DOT just passed a similar tax increase that will generate about $600 million a year more for the state. Now that's the whole state, we acknowledge that, but the local share of that will be pretty consequential. I mean, that's the point, is to, and the whole sales part of that was, this is to upgrade the existing infrastructure. It's not to build a bunch of new sort of naming opportunities, but it's to repair the system. That means fixing severe problems with drainage and flooding. So that source of funding is available. On top of that, and this is one, I'm just throw it out, I know that some people don't agree with this, but the State Infrastructure Bank, which derives money from the sales tax on gas, has sitting in its bank account roughly $400 million to build an extension of 526 to Johns Island. Okay, now, whether you love that project or hate it, we happen not to like it, but many people think it's great. But I don't know, we should do this polling, but I doubt many people would say it is more important to build an interstate to Johns Island than to preserve the physical city as we know it today. And so let's say so we take, let's say, part of that or all of that, there's $400 million at the state level. At the federal level, there are grants through at least 2 programs. FEMA is one, and they provide funding to buy out and move houses, and the city has applied for those to move some houses west Ashley. There also is the Water Resources Development Act, WRDA, which passes every so often. It's reauthorized. It includes projects all over America that are water-related projects like the Battery. So, and the reason I included and identified those sources of funds is that it was important to be able to counter the argument that there's not enough money. I didn't say that every penny from those programs would be available. It won't be. But at the very least, we have an opportunity to go make a case. And the only way we can make a case is if we have a plan. And the only way we have a plan is be honest about what these things are going to cost. And so what I say is the leadership role here is to develop the agenda, to identify the project list and the priorities, to assign cost, to add them up, and then go raise the money to do it. And it's not that hard. Well, let me say too, it often, I think, I and others, and I'm certainly I'm also victim to this potential fallacy, get into the mode of saying, well, let's figure out what we can build, higher walls, more pump stations. The other piece of that is this region is one of the fastest growing regions in America, the Charleston Tri-County region. Similarly, Beaufort, similarly, Myrtle Beach. If we don't make better decisions about where development goes right away, we're going to end up with a much worse situation than we have right now, and much, much worse than it would have to be. So I'd say the first thing we do, and this doesn't cost money, it costs political capital but no money, is we identify the areas we should not be building. And we say these are areas that are flood prone, and they're going to be more flood prone a decade from now. So those are off limits. Those units that would have been built here need to go somewhere else, and then we figure out where else they go. So that's the planning challenge. Where should development go and where shouldn't it go? That can be done, again, fairly quickly because we have the structure of planning and the infrastructure in place. The second thing I would say we need to do is think about where are areas that are natural sponges for water to reside and sort of retain and detain and dissipate. And there are not as many green spaces in Charleston. Actually, some of them correspond to those areas where people shouldn't be building. But we've got, for example, the bridge, old right-of-way of the old Cooper River Bridge. And that area floods. And the city of Charleston recently approved an affordable housing project right there. And I think the question one might ask is, why? I mean, our mode of operation here seems to be to put affordable or low-income housing in the areas that flood. And that's where you see the flooding, whether it's over on Haggett Avenue above the Medical University or on Morrison Drive next to Sanders Clyde. Poor people are located in areas that flood, and that's historical. But we don't need to keep doing that. I mean, we need to change that mode of operation. And so those are the things that are really not, they don't cost money from the taxpayer. They require us to make harder decisions. Now, on the subject of what are the priority investment that we would think of more conventional infrastructure investment projects, I would say things that can be done quickly. And we are doing some drainage. I mean, I don't want to dismiss and give the impression I'm dismissing everything that's been done. We're doing some pretty ambitious things. We're just not doing enough of them fast enough. But the project to improve flooding on the crosstown is moving along. It's quite expensive. We've got a few smaller projects that are drainage projects going on, and some planning, the Calhoun Street West Basin. But I mean, I would just say this maybe is almost as much a personal thing, but it's sort of iconic. The low battery had waves breaking over it, and it was not visible except for the railings. That structure is functionally obsolete. There's a city study that was done in 2009 that warns that it will breach if something isn't done. That needs to be done right away. That can be done right away. It's not, relatively speaking, it's not that expensive. The city estimates $100 million. I've heard from engineers that it would be more than that, maybe 125 or 150. And then extend a bulkhead basically along Lockwood up to Brittlebank. That is a fairly easy to understand, discrete project that needs to be done, I would say, in a top tier project. Other top tier projects are drainage and reconstruction along Morrison where the bridge comes down and where there is public housing. I mean, that is not only is it a economic and a transportation issue, it's a social equity issue, and it just ought to be done. That to me would be another top tier priority. And then we've got the constant and well-known flooding over on Halsey, and these are all Halsey and Bennett Street, and these are all, what they call the West Calhoun Basin. Then we've got the Church Creek Basin, and that is, we know a fair amount about what to do over there. I mean, there's some improvements in drainage as a function of maybe widening Bees Ferry. The Glen McConnell Expressway is almost certainly having a negative impact on that. And when you think about when it was built and when that drainage problem started, it seems plausible. Now, I'm not an engineer, and we don't have a fully developed plan for that, but that's one that needs to be done and dealt with pretty quickly. I'd say those are key priorities, and then also there's their pumping capacity and sort of the response defense component of this, and we need to have pumps that can remove the water that comes in, and then the other thing we can do is put in technology that is more effective at preventing water from coming up on dry weather high tides. This is a comprehensive strategy that it might be more than $1.7 billion, but if you stretch it out over a decade, it's frankly no more than some of these grandiose road projects that people have envisioned, and somehow we've distinguished between saying it's okay for us to spend $750 million on an interstate to Johns Island and saying we need to spend $750 million on flooding. The latter we say, oh, well, that's too expensive. But everybody who likes the 526 project, including the mayor and the city council, think, you know, it's perfectly acceptable to spend $750 million on I-526. The other project I would say that has been expensive and is on the books that people don't seem to have any heartburn over is I-73 from I-95 to Conway, and that old estimates put that at $1.4 billion. So I guess what I'm saying is, you know, expensiveness is sort of in the eye of the beholder. If we as a society have come to accept that road projects like that are expensive and we're okay with it, we need to get up to speed on the expensiveness of flood mitigation projects and agree that the same types of investments are appropriate and not wring our hands and say, this is too expensive. I mean, it's expensive to live on the coast, and it's getting more expensive every decade. Well, we're at the moment we are wildly underprepared for a real hurricane, a Hugo. Now let's just say Hugo. Hugo, though, of course, was not a Category 5 hurricane. It was a 4, I think, when it finally hit. But Irma was really a tropical storm for us. You know, the winds got up to about 70 miles an hour, and we had a 10-foot tide, not a 15-foot tide. So, you know, I guess the point that I would make is that, and this point has been made by city officials, and it's absolutely true, we cannot storm-proof Charleston. I mean, if we get hit by a category, even a 3 at high tide, it's going to be very, very serious and dangerous and damaging. I mean, it'll be billions of dollars of damage. But we can do the best we can do, given what we know statistically again, and again, this is all statistics, to have in place the things that will substantially reduce the damage, that can move the water out as quickly as possible, that can attenuate wind-driven waves, which we didn't do even with Irma, you know, a little tropical storm and a 10-foot tide. The flooding with Irma was, downtown anyway, was a lot of it was wind-driven waves, and the reason they were driven by the wind and not blocked by something is the low battery was too low. I mean, that's pretty obvious. So raise that, it gives us a little bit of a greater margin of safety and of protection. It allows us to go from a tropical storm to a Category 2 hurricane, from a tropical storm hitting at low tide to one hitting at high tide. And I guess my point is, again, that we need to do the best we can do, and acknowledging that if we get hit by an Irma square in the middle, it's going to be, there is going to be an unprecedented and historically unprecedented amount of damage. Maybe in the late 1800s, that 1880 hurricane was something like what we would experience. I guess I'm optimistic about things generally. In this case, I think that optimism has got to be, we need to be optimistic, because if we're not, then we will be defeatist. And I think the reason I'm optimistic is, one, that the solutions here are not difficult to understand, and in the scheme of things, they are not that expensive. They need to be implemented quickly. The time frame is as important in some ways as the agenda is. I think people have reached a point of really being unwilling to sit by passively any longer. We've sat by again for 2 of these episodes, and the third one, I increasingly hear people saying we can't just let the next one come without responding. So I think the public, the political atmosphere here around flood resiliency and storm resiliency is as energetic as it has ever been. Whether that will not continue, I think, just by human nature, as time passes and if we don't have a hurricane next year, then people will begin to forget. But I think if we use this moment of engagement to be able to drive a new policy and have the city and the county and the cities and towns adopt a plan that they can implement with funding, and they've got a timeline, I think we've got a very good shot at making Charleston a place that will survive into the coming decades. Well, I think, as people have said, this is really sort of calls the question of whether the city is going to survive into the next century. I mean, whether the city of Charleston and its environs. I think more attention has been paid, and at some level it's appropriate to the historic peninsula because it's discrete, we understand more clearly what needs to be done here. If we don't do it, then we're going to lose a 300-year-old city. We will effectively lose it in the sense that it will become impassable every couple of weeks because of high water flooding, higher tides. It will be more frequently severely damaged by hurricanes because we haven't prepared for storm surges, wind-driven rains, and a lot of rain. I think Charleston is, I don't want to say doomed, but I'd say that the Charleston we know today is not really assured to be the Charleston anybody will know in the future if we don't respond right away. Yes, unless we act now with these circumstances having revealed themselves to us and people at a point of frustration and desperation and urgency, then we're not going to act. I mean, it isn't going to happen. So we've got the door of opportunity is open. We need to move through it and acknowledge, this is not that difficult. I mean, we've done things in this country that are vastly more difficult than this. And the most commonly used metaphor is the moonshot. Everybody got behind the NASA, initiative to send a man to the moon. I would argue that it's probably more important to protect the stuff we have here. But the point being that we organized ourselves financially and politically and psychologically around that need, the urgency of it, because we thought it was urgent. The Russians were getting there. We needed to get there before they did. So it's the same deal. And we've got the ability with leadership, if we have the leadership, to tap into that energy and direct it in the right way. Well, I think what we've got is a totally confused federal, national environment politically. I mean, there's no direction. It's not clear what the agenda is. On the one hand, there's a focus on infrastructure investment and a big infrastructure policy that are hundreds of billions of dollars. On the other hand, all of it is going to be, or most of it going to be, public-private partnerships. And that's not how you build a storm resilient system. There's no money to be made from that. There's money to be made from toll roads and money to be made from some other public-private initiative, but not storm response. So the current administration's infrastructure proposal is not going to help us. But I also don't think it's a real proposal. I think it's sort of a fiction, that's been floated out there and everybody pretty much acknowledges it's not what we need as a nation. So I think we've got some more practical ears and, well, we've got a more receptive audience in D.C. At the maybe level of the below the administration, and that's fine. I mean, it's fine. We can go to FEMA, we can go to the Corps of Engineers. I mean, there are all sorts of places that are still intact and pretty much working like they were. So, and in some level, this ought to be a lesson to us. I mean, we can't rely on, and shouldn't, we never should have relied on the federal government to come in and save us. We've got to drive this locally, and we go to them and we explain what our agenda is and what we need from them. And that's the way it probably should always work. So the question of whether we can learn from other areas here, the answer is absolutely, and we have to. It's not just from Miami and Norfolk and New York. It's from Great Britain and from the Netherlands and other places that have dealt with this. This is not a new, flooding is not something that other communities, other nations have not dealt with before. So there are a lot of people who know about this. There's leadership, there's technology, there are funding strategies. So we absolutely can learn and should learn from that. And we're actually putting a conference on in another 3 weeks. We're bringing one of the people who wrote the New York plan down to explain how that plan evolved. We're bringing somebody down here from the hazards department at USC. So we're trying to learn from them, and we probably will bring somebody here from the Netherlands, a team here from the Netherlands. So yes, we need to be informed by and learn from these other areas. But I would say the one thing that New York teaches us with Michael Bloomberg is that strong, bold leadership can advance very ambitious agendas. And it did with the post-Sandy response. The Bloomberg New York plan, which was a number of billions of dollars, and it included everything from soft resiliency, better community communications and response, to pretty, in some ways, wild ideas of putting flap gates in in New York Harbor. I mean, it was the whole suite of options, and it was expensive. But I think Mayor Bloomberg made the case in a way that was compelling enough that there was virtually no disagreement about the importance of doing it. And that would be the same here. I mean, they're really, so I'd say the lessons are at least that we can learn are at least as important at a political level as they are at a technological level. I think in terms of this, the dynamic between local, state, and federal, again, there's got to be, in order to be successful, I think, there's got to be a vision that's comprehensive and compelling. It can be ambitious, and it has to be ambitious here, but it needs to first have a level of specificity and comprehensiveness that will solve the problem. I mean, what we want to be able to do is go to people who can help us and say, we figured out what we need to do, but we need your resources to help, or they're actually our resources at the state and federal level to help pay for it. And I think what I would say is that, you know, if you look again at the Ravenel Bridge, that was a $660 million project, which today would be over $1 billion, and one of the most expensive investments that has been made in South Carolina, a single investment ever. We found state funding to do it. They even created a new instrument to do it called the State Transportation Infrastructure Bank. But it was, again, driven locally, and the conduit to the state was through our representatives. In the case of that bridge, Senator Arthur Ravenel. But the same mechanism is available now. We need to go to Congressman Sanford and Senator Graham, Senator Scott, and basically say, you know, you guys, part of your job, and we're not talking about bring the bacon home and earmark, we're talking about what a proper job of representation is. I mean, it's to have our case pled at the national level, on the national stage. And the case being, again, if it were a WRDA project, a water resources Act project, then we want to make sure we're in that bill, that we get included in that WRDA bill for whatever it is, $500 million, whatever the amount of money is that's necessary. Other places will do that, and in fact, if we don't do it, we'll be excluded from that pool by virtue of just the fact that it is limited. So they're not going to come to us, you know. I guess that's the thing. And they're also not going to listen to a vague kind of complaint. They're going to want to know that if we do this, is it going to fix the problem or not? And we have an obligation to explain at a fairly high level of detail what it is we need to do and why it will fix the problem. Well, the first question I think is easier, and there are a couple of different aspects to that. The question is why should somebody in Columbia or Aiken or Greenville care about storm mitigation in Charleston, and why should that person, that taxpayer, be willing to allow his or her tax dollars to go down here? And I think we need to basically say at this point to a disproportionate extent. I mean, what we're facing a problem, a crisis here that Columbia is not facing. You know, neither is Greenville. I mean, there's not flood water rising in Columbia, except maybe every now and then along the Congo River. So the point I would make is first a pretty sort of pedestrian and dry economic argument. The coast is a major driver of the state's economy. We have the core of the tourism economy here in Charleston and Myrtle Beach and Hilton Head. And so much of the revenue that comes into the state, more of it disproportionately, that comes from tourism comes from here. Similarly, we are the port for the state of South Carolina, not just for Charleston. So Greenville benefits and depends on our port, and it depends on our transportation infrastructure working well, and it depends on trucks and trains being able to get in and out. So there's an economic argument to be made that we are one integrated economy, and that we can't just say, well, I pay my dollar in taxes has got to go to my house in Forest Acres. And most people understand that. I think they understand and agree with that. And the other point is that, you know, I think we all appreciate that there will be needs that emerge that one region has that are greater than they are in other regions. I mean, for example, and I hope, I mean, I'm not going to say that this is a persuasive political argument necessarily, but I think it should be. We have a greater need for investment in early childhood education along the I-95 corridor than we do in some parts of Richland County or Charleston County. And I think I understand that, even though I live in Charleston County. I'm willing to make that investment as part of my tax burden. So I think that we understand that we're all one state, we're all one economy, we're all at some level one people who need at different times different resource allocation. So, yeah, and again, that takes leadership. It's going to require somebody to go make that case. We always have to do that. I mean, we've always ought to be able to defend what we're asking for, and I think we can absolutely do it in this case. To the question of whether, I guess the question of whether we can change the mental timeline that we operate under, the psychological time horizon of being short-term next year or this decade, I think we can do that. I think in some ways South Carolina is better prepared to do that than some places. We've got a deep history. It's not all beautiful, but it's all something that represents the course of our evolution as a people. And I think that most people who live here appreciate that, and also appreciate the importance of it continuing. and that we need to preserve things that mean something to us historically, but also preserve things that will mean something to our children and our grandchildren. A functioning city, functioning transportation systems, housing that's not low-income housing, that's not constantly threatened with or damaged by flooding. You know, it's a communitarian idea, and I don't know that we're any less communitarian than other states. I think we seem to be, most people are proud of being South Carolinians. Sometimes we're embarrassed by it, but sometimes, but ultimately we can say, you know, we've done things that are admirable, and this is one of them. I mean, there's nothing more admirable than preserving and enhancing a community, its social infrastructure, its economic infrastructure for the next generation. So that's what we're really talking about here, and I think making that argument is, it's certainly for anybody who has children, and even people who don't have children, and maybe people who never have children. I think that's a credible, persuasive argument.